In the sun-scorched valleys of southern Arizona, Michael Harrison tended his modest farm in peaceful solitude, or at least he tried to. A legendary Green Beret sniper with over 100 confirmed kills and countless classified missions behind him, Mike had returned home 3 years ago, seeking quiet after decades of combat. But it wasn't his military wounds that haunted him most. It was the loss of his entire team in a mission gone wrong in the mountains of Afghanistan, a mission whose details remained classified even now. When Mexico's most ruthless cartel marked his remote farmland as their new staging ground, they thought they'd found an easy target, a solitary old man with a small spread of land in a strategic location. What followed was 5 days of calculated violence that would expose corruption, test loyalties, and push a community to its breaking point. But the most extraordinary part, the precision with which a single farmer eliminated an entire cartel cell, shot by impossible shot, each target falling to a marksman they never saw coming. Some called what happened in Paradise Valley divine intervention, others called it karma, but for those who witnessed a retired warrior defend his home with skills forgotten by none who served with him, it was nothing short of legendary. This is his story. The morning sun painted Arizona's Sonoran desert in shades of amber and gold as Michael Harrison completed his daily perimeter check of Saguaro Ridge Farm. At 64, his movements remained deliberate and efficient, decades of military discipline evident in every step. A weathered Stetson cast shadows across his tanned face, deep lines marking years spent in far harsher environments than this desert morning. The farm stood as an oasis in the arid landscape, 40 acres of carefully irrigated soil where Mike grew organic vegetables for local markets. The modest operation had been his father's dream, abandoned when cancer took him 5 years ago. Now it served as Mike's refuge, a place to quiet the echoes of combat that still rang in his mind. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon, old habits that had kept him alive through 3 decades of special operations missions. The ridge, as locals called it, offered perfect sightlines in all directions. It was one of the reasons he'd chosen this place, though he rarely admitted that tactical advantage had influenced his farming decisions. Inside the farmhouse, Mike went through his morning routine with military precision. Coffee, black, a quick check of his security cameras, another habit he'd never explained to his neighbors. The local news played quietly on his tablet as he reviewed footage from the night sensors. Movement caught his eye. Just a coyote testing his fence line again. The phone rang, breaking the morning silence. Lucy's diner flashed on the screen. "Mike, you coming in for breakfast today?" Lucy Martinez's voice carried the warmth of 15 years of friendship. She'd kept the diner running after her husband passed, turning it into the heart of their small community. "On my way, Lucy, the usual. Hash browns extra crispy, just like always. And I've got those organic tomatoes from your last delivery getting rave reviews." The drive into Paradise Valley took 18 minutes in his well-maintained Ford pickup. The truck had belonged to his father, and like everything else Mike owned, it was kept in perfect working order. The town hadn't changed much in the decades he'd known it. 2,500 souls, one main street, and enough space between neighbors to keep everyone civil. Lucy's diner sat at the corner of Main and Desert Rose, its neon sign still buzzing faintly in the morning light. As Mike parked, he noticed an unfamiliar black SUV with California plates across the street. New faces weren't uncommon during tourist season, but something about the vehicle raised old instincts. "Morning, Mike," Lucy called as he entered, already, moving toward his usual booth by the window. At 58, she moved with the energy of someone 20 years younger, her dark hair streaked with silver that she refused to dye. "Busy morning?" Quiet as always. Mike settled into the booth, positioning himself with clear views of both the entrance and the street. "How's business?" "Had some interesting visitors earlier." Lucy's tone was casual, but her eyes held concern. 3 men in suits asking about property values. Said they represent some investment group, been asking around town all week. Mike nodded, scanning the diner. The morning regulars were all in their usual spots. Dave at the counter, the Wilson sisters by the window, old Pete with his crossword puzzle. But there was tension in the air, subtle but present. Rodriguez brothers were in here too, Lucy continued, lower now. Looking like they'd just won the lottery. Said they finally sold that worthless land of theirs up by Ghost Canyon. Mike's coffee paused halfway to his lips. The Rodriguez brothers had been trying to sell that 200 acres for years, but the terrain was too rough for development. Who'd buy that mess? Same folks in the suits, apparently. Paid cash, from what I hear. Before Mike could respond, the diner's door chimed. 2 men entered, one tall and lean, the other shorter but heavily built. Both wore expensive suits that looked out of place in Paradise Valley. Mike noticed their eyes scanning the diner, lingering briefly on exits and windows. "Mom," the taller. One addressed Lucy, his accent distinctly Sonoran. "Mind if we get some coffee to go?" As Lucy moved to serve them, Mike noticed their practiced movements, the way they maintained space between themselves. The shorter one's jacket shifted, revealing a glimpse of a shoulder holster. Mike's phone buzzed, a text from his old friend, Jack Torres, now a detective in Phoenix. "Need to talk. Cartel activity picking up in your area. Call me." The men collected their coffee and left, their black SUV pulling away smoothly. Tom watched through the window as they headed toward Ghost Canyon Road. "They've been here 3 times this week," Lucy said, returning. "Always watching, always asking questions." Mike finished his coffee, his mind already working through implications. "Thanks for breakfast, Lucy. Keep your eyes open." Outside, the morning heat was building. Mike noticed the Rodriguez brothers emerging from the bank across the street. Manuel Rodriguez caught his eye and smirked, patting his breast pocket. Back in his truck, Mike pulled out his phone to call Jack. As he waited for the connection, his eyes drifted to the rearview mirror. For a moment, the morning light caught the faded green beret patch he kept tucked in the visor, a reminder of who he'd been, who he still was beneath the farmer's exterior. The official report said his team had been caught in a complex ambush, but Mike knew better. Someone had compromised their position, fed intelligence to the enemy. The investigation had gone nowhere, classified and buried like so many others. He still saw their faces in his dreams. Wilson, Chen, Martinez, Torres. Good men lost because someone had sold them out. Jack's voice broke through. "Mike, we need to talk about what's coming your way. It's worse than we thought." Mike took a deep breath, pushing the memories aside. "I'm heading home now. Tell me everything." As he drove back towards Saguaro Ridge Farm, the morning sun fully risen now, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life was about to change. 3 years of peace, of healing, of trying to forget, all of it felt suddenly fragile. In the distance, thunder rolled through the mountains. Or maybe it was just his imagination. The war he'd left behind was finding its way home, and this time the battlefield would be his own backyard. But unlike the cartels, Mike knew every inch of this terrain, every angle, every shadow. If they thought they'd found an easy target in an old farmer, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. The truck kicked up dust as he turned onto the farm's access road. Mike's mind was already calculating sight lines, estimating ranges to key points, remembering where he'd stored certain equipment he'd hoped never to need again. The skills were still there, sharp as ever beneath the peaceful facade he'd built. Above, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily in the thermal currents, its shadow sliding across the desert floor. Mike watched it for a moment, remembering similar birds over other battlefields. The hawk suddenly banked away sharply, as if sensing something changing in its territory. The war was coming home, but this time Mike would choose the ground, set the terms, control the engagement. They would learn what his enemies in 3 theaters of war had learned. Sometimes the deadliest predator is the one you never see coming. Jack Torres's truck kicked up dust as it wound up the dirt road to Saguaro Ridge Farm. Mike watched from his covered porch, noting how his old friend still drove with tactical awareness, taking the curves wide to maintain visibility. 25 years of law enforcement had only sharpened the habits they'd both learned in special forces. "You look like hell," Mike said as Jack stepped out. Manila folders tucked under his arm. His friend's face showed the strain of sleepless nights. "Yeah, well, 4 days without sleep will do that." Jack climbed the porch steps, nodding appreciatively at the defensive layout Mike had maintained. The raised position offered clear fields of fire in all directions. Inside, Jack spread crime scene photos across the kitchen table. In the last 8 months, La Familia has been pushing north aggressively. They're not just passing through anymore, they're setting up infrastructure. Mike studied the surveillance photos. The men from Lucy's diner appeared in several, meeting with known cartel lieutenants. The suits from this morning, Miguel Ramirez and Carlos Ortega, mid-level guys but connected. They've been buying property all through Arizona, setting up front businesses. Jack tapped one photo, showing the Rodriguez brothers. Your local boys have been helping them launder money through real estate deals. Ghost Canyon, Mike remembered. Lucy's words about the land sale. Exactly. Perfect spot for a distribution hub. Remote, hard to surveil, multiple escape routes. Jack rubbed his eyes. But that's not what worries me most. A vehicle approaching caught their attention. Through the window, they watched Sheriff David Cooper's patrol car pull onto the property. "Speaking of complications," Jack muttered. Mike opened the door before Cooper could knock. At 45, David Cooper carried himself with the swagger of small-town authority, his clean-cut appearance masking questionable loyalties. "Harrison," he nodded to Mike, then spotted Jack. "Detective, didn't expect to see Phoenix PD out here." "Just visiting my old friend, Sheriff." Jack's tone was neutral, but Mike noted how his hand stayed close to his weapon. Cooper's eyes lingered on the photos visible through the doorway. Funny time for a social call, especially with all these new investors in town. Something we should know about. "Just keeping the peace, Sheriff." Mike kept his voice even. "These businessmen are bringing opportunities to the valley. Some folks might not like change, but it's coming." Cooper adjusted his gun belt. "Be a shame if anyone caused trouble." After he left, Jack swore quietly. "He's on their payroll. Has to be." Mike watched the patrol car disappear down the road. "How long do we have?" "They're moving fast. That land sale is just the beginning. They're planning something big, and soon." Jack gathered the photos. "I've got contacts in the DEA, but by the time they build a case, it'll be too late. Mike moved to the window, scanning the tree line out of habit. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property. His eyes caught movement, a glint of sunlight off metal in the distance. Then nothing. Someone was watching the house. Need to make some calls, Jack said. Still got contacts from the unit who owe me favors. How much heat can you take at work? Already on thin ice looking into this. Captain's got friends with beach houses in Cancun, if you know what I mean. Headlights appeared at the end of the drive. 3 vehicles approaching slowly. Company. Mike moved to his gun safe, entering the combination. Back door, go. They see your truck here, you're dead. I'll handle this. Jack hesitated, then slipped out the back. Mike heard his truck start up on the service road behind the house. The vehicles stopped in front of the house, 2 SUVs and a pickup. Car doors opened and closed. Mike counted footsteps on gravel. 8 men, spreading out with military precision. Mr. Harrison, a voice called out. Miguel Ramirez from the diner. We'd like to discuss a business opportunity. Coming, Mike called back, his mind already mapping angles, cover, escape routes. 3 years of peace crumbling in an evening. As he reached for the door, his eyes caught the old green beret patch in its frame. An old prayer surfaced from memory, one he'd learned in selection. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil. Mike stepped onto the porch, into the fading daylight. The men were spread out in front of their vehicles, trying to look casual and failing. Miguel stood front and center, smiling like a salesman about to make his pitch. Beautiful property you have here, Mr. Harrison, very strategic. Miguel's smile didn't reach his eyes. Mike said nothing, letting the silence stretch. He'd learned long ago that silence made people nervous, made them fill the void with words they hadn't meant to say. We represent some investors who've taken an interest in Paradise Valley. Your land would complete the package nicely. Miguel spread his hands. We're prepared to be very generous. Not interested. Mike kept his voice flat. Mr. Harrison, Miguel's smile flickered. Progress is coming to Paradise Valley. Better to be part of it than in the way. A breeze stirred up dust from the drive. In the distance, thunder rolled through the mountains. For a moment, Mike thought he saw movement at the tree line. Another observer, then nothing. You have 24 hours to reconsider, Miguel said, the pretense of friendliness falling away. After that, well, he shrugged. Things happen in the desert, accidents. They backed away to their vehicles, maintaining eye contact. Mike noticed Manuel Rodriguez in one of the SUVs, looking anywhere but at him. Inside, Mike picked up his phone, scrolling through old numbers he'd hoped never to use again. The war was definitely coming home, but this time he would choose the battlefield. The training never really left you. The awareness, the planning, the cold calculation of angles and distances. He moved to the basement, unlocking a heavy steel. Drugder, he'd told neighbors, was for farm equipment storage. Inside, gun safes lined one wall. But Mike went to the back, to a locked cabinet that hadn't been opened in 3 years. The Beret M82 was exactly as he'd left it, cleaned and oiled, wrapped in protective cloth. The .50 caliber rifle had been his constant companion through countless missions, reaching out to targets over a mile away with lethal precision. Mike ran his hands over the familiar weapon, muscle memory taking over as he checked every component. In another cabinet, his ghillie suit hung ready, desert pattern, meticulously maintained despite years of disuse. His phone buzzed, Jack sending coordinates of Cartel safe houses they'd identified. Mike added them to his mental map, calculating ranges, approaches, firing positions. They thought they were dealing with an old farmer. They were about to learn they were dealing with a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of dealing death from the shadows. The basement also held his reloading equipment. Mike had told neighbors it was for hunting ammunition. Technically true, though not the kind of hunting they imagined. He began the meticulous process of hand-loading 50 caliber rounds, each one crafted for maximum accuracy at extreme range. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of one of Arizona's summer storms. Perfect weather for what was coming. Wind and rain complicated long-range shooting, but they also covered movement, masked sound, reduced visibility. The storm would be his ally. Mike worked through the night preparing. More than the weapons, more than the ammunition, he prepared mentally, returning to that cold, focused state that had made him legendary among special operations snipers. They had brought war to his home. He would show them what war really meant. By dawn, everything was ready. Mike walked his property one final time, noting changes in vegetation that would affect wind calls, memorizing subtle terrain features that could provide hide positions. In the growing light, Saguaro Ridge Farm looked peaceful, beautiful even, but it had become something else, a carefully prepared killing ground. The storm was building in the mountains, dark clouds gathering like an omen. Mike allowed himself a small, cold smile. They had given him 24 hours to reconsider. He had used those hours to prepare a response they would never forget. The pre-dawn choir shattered as Lucy's diner erupted in flames. Mike watched from across the street as fire trucks wailed in the distance. Lucy stood wrapped in a blanket, face streaked with soot, but chin held high. "Gas line," they said. Lucy's voice trembled with anger rather than fear. Funny how it happened. Right after I refused their offer, Mike studied the burning building. The fire pattern was too precise, too controlled. Anyone see anything? Just a black SUV, like the ones that have been following me home all week. Sheriff Cooper arrived, boots crunching on broken glass. Looks like that inspection report was right about the gas lines, Lucy. Lucky you weren't inside. Inspection? What inspection? Lucy straightened. Cooper handed her a paper. Mike caught the date. Tomorrow's date. His hand tightened on his concealed holster as Cooper caught his look. "Something to say, Harrison?" Before Mike could respond, a motorcycle roared up Main Street, stopping beside them. The rider dismounted, removing his helmet to reveal a weathered face Mike hadn't seen in 4 years. "Carlos Vega." Mike allowed himself a small smile. "Long way from Fort Bragg. Got your message. Thought you might need some backup." Carlos, former 7th Special Forces Group weapons sergeant, surveyed the burning diner. "Though looks like the party started without me." Cooper stepped forward. "This is a local police matter. Why don't you go direct traffic or something?" Carlos's tone was polite, but carried steel beneath. As Cooper stalked away, Carlos turned to Mike. "Your friend Jack's intel was right. La Familia is moving major weight through here, using multiple properties as distribution points. The Rodriguez brothers are dead." Carlos's words fell like stones. "Found their truck off Ghost Canyon Road an hour ago. Looks like our friends decided to tie up loose ends." Mike's attention caught on movement across the street. Through the thinning smoke, he glimpsed a figure watching from the shadows. Tall, military bearing, then gone. Carlos followed his gaze. "What?" Mike shook his head. "We need to move. Lucy, pack a bag. Carlos has a safe house in Phoenix." "I'm not running," Lucy said firmly. "Not running, getting clear so we can fight back." 3 more vehicles pulled into town. black SUVs with tinted windows. Men in suits stepped out, trying too hard to look casual. "Coopers bought," Mike muttered. "Probably half the department too." "More than half," Carlos confirmed. "But I brought friends." He nodded toward the hills where glints of morning sun revealed optical scopes. "Your old unit sends their regards. Multiple breaches detecting unprecedented energy signatures. Mike's radio crackled. Position 4 compromised, possible hostile observation. Mike watched as more cartel vehicles arrived, no longer bothering to hide their presence. They were making a show of force, trying to intimidate the town. But they didn't understand what they were walking into. Carlos was giving orders on his radio, positioning their backup. Mike touched the comlink he'd been given, connecting to the old team frequency. Familiar voices responded, ghosts from his past coming back when needed most. "Remember Kandahar?" Carlos asked quietly. "When we were outnumbered 10-1? Those were better odds than this. Thunder rolled through the mountains, actual thunder this time, promising rain. But the storm wouldn't be enough to wash away what was coming. Lucy's diner collapsed in on itself, sending sparks into the dawn sky. Across town, engines started as more cartel vehicles arrived. Cooper's deputies began setting up checkpoints, but facing the wrong way, keeping people in, not out. Mike's phone buzzed, Jack sending surveillance photos from Phoenix. The cartel's operation was bigger than they'd thought. Paradise Valley was just the beginning, but as he studied the photos, another message came through, a warning from one of his old spotters. Movement detected in the high ground professional. Operators setting up observation posts. "They're preparing something," Carlos said, checking his weapon. "This isn't just about territory anymore. They're sending a message." Mike watched as more SUVs arrived. Cartel soldiers poorly disguised as businessmen. They moved with military precision. Someone was providing training, expertise. "Got movement on the ridge," one of their shooters reported through the radio. "Multiple teams setting up firing positions. They're trying to box us in," Carlos observed. "Control all the high ground. Let them try." Mike's voice was cold. He'd spent decades mastering these exact tactics. The cartel might have numbers and firepower, but they were playing his game now. Rain began to fall as Mike and Carlos moved through back alleys, staying out of sight. The storm would work in their favor. Complicated targeting solutions, masked movement, reduced visibility. "Teams in position," the radio crackled. Their own shooters were set, waiting patiently in carefully chosen hides. Mike checked his Beret. One final time. The .50 caliber rifle was zeroed for extreme range, each round hand-loaded for maximum accuracy. In this weather, shooting would be challenging, but that's what thousands of hours of training were for. "Remember," Mike said into his radio, "they make the first move. We want them fully committed before we spring the trap." More cartel vehicles arrived, spreading through town. They were being obvious about it now, wanting to be seen, wanting to intimidate. "Getting cocky," Carlos observed. "They think they've got us surrounded." "They do." Mike allowed himself a small, cold smile. "Exactly where we want them." Thunder crashed overhead as the storm intensified. Through the rain, Mike caught glimpses of cartel operators moving into position. They had training, but they were sloppy, silhouettes visible against the skyline, poor use of cover. "Count is up to 30 vehicles," one of their spotters reported. "At least 60 armed tangos." "They're not just here to pressure us," Carlos said. "This is an elimination operation. They want to make an example." "They'll make an example all right," Mike replied. "Just not the one they intended. The rain grew heavier, reducing visibility, perfect weather for what was coming. The cartel troops would be focused on staying dry, their attention divided. They wouldn't be watching the shadows. Through his scope, Mike observed their deployments. They were setting up for a coordinated assault, trying to look professional. But he could see the gaps in their coverage, the blind spots they'd left exposed. "Remember your training," Mike transmitted to his shooters. "Wait for my mark. One shot, one kill, then melt away. No heroics." The storm reached its peak, rain hammering down as lightning split the sky. In the poor visibility, the cartel soldiers grew bolder, moving more openly. "They're getting ready to move," Carlos warned. "Let them come," Mike replied softly. "The trap is set. The stage was prepared. Now it was just a matter of patience, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the ambush. The cartel had brought the war to his home. He would show them what war really meant. Through the rain, Paradise Valley waited. The coming violence would change it forever, but there was no avoiding that now. The only question was, who would be left standing when the storm cleared? Mike settled into his firing position, breathing, slow and controlled. The familiar weight of the Beret pressed against his shoulder. In his scope, cartel soldiers continued their preparations, unaware they were already in his crosshairs. The thunder rolled again, masking the sound of bolts. Being quietly drawn back, of safeties being silently clicked off, the trap was set. Now they just had to wait for the enemy to spring it. Rain hammered the valley as Mike and Carlos crouched behind the overturned truck, gunfire sparking against metal. The cartel's men were pushing their position from three sides, trying to establish fire superiority. Through his scope, Mike watched their movements with cold calculation. 8 on the right, Carlos's voice crackled through the comm. Another 5 moving up the creek bed. Cooper, still playing both sides, got his units blocking. The highway, claiming it's a local disturbance. Thunder crashed overhead, but beneath it came another sound. Boots on wet ground, moving with military precision. Mike tracked the movement through his optics, noting their formations. They had training, but their confidence made them sloppy. "They're pushing us toward the canyon." Mike switched magazines, using the weather for cover. "That's not their only problem," Carlos grinned, pressing his radio. "Sierra team, light it up." Flashbangs burst along the cartel's right flank, sowing confusion as hidden operators emerged from concealed positions. Mike's old unit was making their presence known. Miguel's voice carried through the storm, ordering his men to fall back toward Ghost Canyon. They didn't make it far. The first shot from Mike's Beret echoed like thunder, the .50 caliber round finding its target at 800 meters. The cartel soldier didn't even have time to register the sound before going down. 2 more shots. In rapid succession, 2 more targets eliminated. "That's some fine shooting, old man," Carlos observed, putting down suppressing fire as Mike reloaded. "Lucy just checked in," Jack's voice came through their comms. "Sheriff's department just got orders to pull back all units." Orders came from higher up. "State level," Carlos swore. "They're burning their connections, cutting ties." The rain intensified, but now it worked in their favor. The cartel's men, unused to combat in these conditions, lost cohesion in the weather. Mike's old unit pressed the advantage, herding them toward prepared positions. Through his scope, Mike caught movement on the ridge. More cartel operators trying to establish high ground. 3 quick shots rang out. 3 bodies fell. The message was clear. There would be no safe haven on the high ground. Miguel's voice again, desperate now, ordering his men toward waiting vehicles. But they never reached them. Mike's team had the angles covered, methodically eliminating anyone who tried to reach the evacuation point. Martinez's team, shift fire right, Mike commanded through the comm. Don't let them establish a base of fire on that ridgeline. The storm had turned the valley into a killing ground. Visibility was poor, but that hardly mattered to shooters who had trained for exactly these conditions. The cartel's men were learning a harsh lesson about the difference between intimidation and actual combat. Jack just sent an update. Carlos checked his phone. They found something in the Rodriguez brothers' files. This goes higher than we thought. Federal judges, Congress members. Later, Mike switched channels. Sierra lead, push them east. Let's end this. The battle shifted toward Ghost Canyon, where the valley narrowed. Rain-slicked rocks made any escape treacherous, and Mike's team knew every inch of the terrain. Through his scope, Mike spotted Cooper's patrol car parked at the canyon overlook. The sheriff stood watching, face unreadable as his chosen side crumbled. Miguel made a final stand by the creek, ordering his remaining men to hold position. But they weren't fighting local law enforcement anymore. They faced ghosts, operators who moved like shadows through the storm, led by a sniper whose accuracy seemed to defy the laws of physics. Federal response team is 20 minutes out, Jack. Reported. They won't find much, Carlos replied, watching the last of the cartel's men surrender. The rain began to ease as Mike surveyed the aftermath through his scope. Bodies lay scattered across the valley, precision shots having found their marks despite the challenging conditions. The cartel had brought overwhelming force, but they'd walked into a masterfully prepared ambush. "Cooper's moving," one of their spotters reported. Through his scope, Mike watched the sheriff drive away, leaving his men to face the consequences of their corruption. "We've got wounded tangos," Carlos reported. "None of ours hit. Your boys still know how to shoot." Mike began breaking down his rifle, movements automatic after decades of practice. The Beret had served him well, reaching out to targets at extreme ranges despite the weather. Each shot had found its mark. The cartel would learn to fear the unseen sniper of Paradise Valley. "State police will be here soon," Jack's voice came through. "They're bringing a task force, federal oversight. This is going to make waves." "Let someone else ride those waves," Mike replied, securing his weapon. The immediate threat was eliminated. The cleanup would be someone else's problem. The sun broke through the clouds as the last of the cartel's survivors were secured. Their attempt to take Paradise Valley had ended in complete disaster. Professional arrogance had led them to underestimate what one highly trained operator and his team could accomplish. "Final count?" Mike asked as they regrouped. 28 confirmed. Carlos checked his notes. Another 15 wounded, no civilian casualties. Clean operation. Through the clearing weather, Mike observed the aftermath. The valley would recover, but it would never be quite the same. The peace he'd sought here had been shattered, but perhaps that was inevitable. You couldn't really leave the war behind. Sometimes it found you. "Federal teams are securing evidence from the Rodriguez property," Jack reported. "Files, accounts, connections. This is going to expose corruption at every level." Mike nodded, but his attention was elsewhere. Through his scope, he watched the heights where his shooters were already disappearing, ghosts returning to shadow. They had come when called, performed their duty with precision, and now they would vanish back into civilian life until needed again. "Lucy's already talking about rebuilding," Carlos mentioned. "Says she's thinking of adding a veterans wall when she reopens the diner." The storm had cleared completely now, sunlight gleaming off wet rocks. In the distance, sirens announced the arrival of state authorities. The official response was finally arriving, long after the real work was done. "They'll want statements," Jack warned. "The feds will have questions." "They always do," Mike replied. "They won't get answers." Some stories weren't meant to be told. Some operations needed to remain in shadow. The cartel had learned a costly lesson about underestimating quiet old men in remote places. That was enough. Paradise Valley would rebuild, heal, move forward. But it would do so with a new understanding that sometimes the deadliest predators were the ones you never saw coming. That beneath the peaceful facade of an old farmer might lurk the skills of a warrior. "You know they'll try again somewhere else," Carlos said as they watched federal teams begin their investigation. "They always do," Mike agreed, "and we'll be ready." The sun climbed higher, drying the rain-soaked valley. Birds began to return, nature reclaiming the battlefield. To casual observers, it might soon appear as if nothing had happened here. But the cartel would remember. They would tell stories about the sniper they never saw, the shots that came from nowhere, the ambush that decimated their forces. Mike shouldered his rifle case, heading home to his farm. The war had found him again, but he had been ready. Some skills never faded. Some lessons were written in blood and bone. The cartel had brought violence to his home, and he had responded with the cold precision that had made him legendary. Paradise Valley would heal, but it would never forget. And somewhere in Mexico, cartel leaders would learn to fear the stories of an old farmer who had turned their own ambush against them, who had reached out with a sniper's precision to eliminate their forces one by one. The peace Mike had sought might be gone, but perhaps this was better. A peace defended rather than merely enjoyed, a community protected by skills honed in far deadlier places. He had tried to leave the war behind, but when it found him, he had proven that some warriors never truly retire. 2 weeks after the Ghost Canyon firefight, Lucy's diner was rising from its ashes. The morning sun caught sawdust in the air as volunteers worked, the sound of hammers echoing down Main Street. Mike watched from across the road, coffee cooling in his hand, as he observed the reconstruction with tactical precision. Carlos approached, holding a manila envelope. "Found this in the cartel's files. Thought you should see it." Inside were military documents, classified reports, and surveillance photos. Mike's hands stilled on a particular page, intelligence assessments of known special operations veterans in the region. They had been watching him, studying his background, but their arrogance had led them to underestimate what he was still capable of. They were mapping out potential threats, Carlos explained. Your name was at the top of their list, but they figured age had dulled your skills. Big mistake. Across the street, Lucy directed volunteers, her voice carrying over the construction noise. The new diner would be larger, with a dedicated space for community meetings and, as promised, a veterans' wall of honor. Found something else too. Carlos pulled out another document. Remember that Distinguished Service Cross they awarded you in Baghdad? Pentagon's reviewing it, talking about an upgrade to the Medal of Honor. Mike watched the street, scanning for threats out of habit. 2 weeks of peace hadn't dulled his vigilance. Let it lie. Some stories need to stay buried. Jack's police truck pulled up, windows down. Got movement up at Ghost Canyon. Looks like Miguel had a backup plan. How many? 2 vehicles, heavily armed. Last desperate play. Mike nodded to Carlos, who was already on his radio coordinating with their remaining team members, but this time they wouldn't need them. Just us, Mike said quietly, checking his Beret. The drive up Ghost Canyon took 10 minutes. Mike parked off-road, movement ahead confirming Jack's intel. 2 SUVs, men with rifles, desperation making them careless. What followed wasn't really a fight. With 2 experienced operators moving like shadows through the rocks, it was over. Before it began, the last of Miguel's men surrendered to state police within the hour. Back in town, the construction continued. Lucy had somehow produced lunch for all the volunteers, the smell of her famous chili drawing more helpers. Mike found the new sheriff, Jack Cooper, reviewing security plans. The town had changed, not just physically, but in spirit. They'd faced darkness and chosen light. Got 3 more K9 unit applications, Cooper said. Seems you started a trend. Evening found Mike on his porch, watching the sunset behind the mountains. The Pentagon ceremony would come later, so would the official. Inquiries, the media requests, the curious visitors. But for now, in the Arizona twilight, Mike Harrison sat with his rifle cleaned and oiled beside him, watching his community rebuild. Jack's truck was parked next to Carlos's motorcycle, the impromptu gathering becoming more frequent lately. The smell of Lucy's cooking drifted from the kitchen, where she'd insisted on making dinner for what she called her guardian angels. Federal task force finished their final report, Carlos mentioned, cleaning his own weapon with practiced ease. Trace the corruption all the way to Washington. Politicians are falling like dominoes. Mike watched as more volunteers arrived to help with the diner's reconstruction. Paradise Valley had come together in the aftermath of violence, stronger for having faced the darkness. Martinez made a deal, Carlos added. Full cooperation for reduced sentence. He's been naming names all week. The evening sun caught the new sign at Lucy's diner. Where heroes gather. It had been her idea, dear, but it felt right. This place wasn't just about serving food anymore. It was about preserving what was worth fighting for. Mike's phone buzzed. Messages from his old unit, updates on cartel movements further south. They had learned to fear Paradise Valley, learned that some quiet places held deadly secrets. Town council meeting tonight, Carlos reminded him. They want to discuss making Paradise Valley a regional law enforcement training hub. The idea would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. But things had changed. The cartel's attempt to corrupt their town had instead revealed its strength, its resilience, its unwillingness to bow to darkness. Lucy's truck pulled up, bringing dinner for what she now called her security detail. She'd made it her mission to feed anyone who had helped defend the town, claiming protectors needed proper fuel. Got the final insurance check, she announced. Thinking of adding a second floor to the diner, make it a proper gathering place. The afternoon brought more visitors, reporters working on follow-up stories, police chiefs interested in training opportunities, even a few senators trying to rebuild their law enforcement credentials in the wake of the corruption scandal. But Mike's focus remained on his community, on the quiet strength that had emerged in the face of violence. Professional arrogance had led the cartel to underestimate not just him, but the entire town. "You ever miss it?" Carlos asked quietly. "The old life?" Mike watched as Lucy organized the evening's volunteers, her diner rising stronger than before. "Miss what?" "What we did, who we were." Through his scope, Mike observed the surrounding hills out of habit. The Beret was never far from reach these days, not out of fear, but readiness. Sometimes, but this is better. Evening approached, painting the mountains in familiar purple and gold. The town had healed, but it had also grown stronger. What the cartel had intended as a base for corruption had become something else entirely, a place of resilience. Lucy called everyone in. For dinner, the diner's temporary kitchen, already famous for feeding those who helped rebuild. The Veterans Wall was taking shape, photos and medals, telling stories of service and sacrifice. Mike joined them, noting how naturally Jack and Carlos had integrated into the community. They had come to help fight a battle, but they had stayed to help build something worth protecting. Federal Oversight Committee wants a report, Jack mentioned between bites. They're trying to understand how one old farmer and a few friends took down an entire cartel operation. Let them wonder, Mike replied. Some stories were better left in shadow, some victories better left unexamined. The sun set behind his property. As they finished dinner, stars beginning to emerge in the desert sky. Paradise Valley had faced its trial by fire and emerged stronger. The peace wasn't perfect, but it was real, earned through vigilance and protected by skills honed in darker places. "You know they're telling stories about you in Mexico," Carlos said with a grin. "The ghost sniper of Paradise Valley, the invisible death that comes from nowhere." Mike allowed himself a small smile. Let them tell their stories. Let them fear the quiet places, the unassuming old men who might be more than they appear. Sometimes the best victories were the ones that lived on in whispered warnings. Lucy's diner would reopen soon, stronger than before. Paradise Valley would continue to grow, protected by a network of warriors who had chosen to make it their home. The cartel had thought they found an easy target. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous, a community unwilling to bow to evil, protected by those who knew how to fight it. The war had found Mike Harrison again, but this time, he hadn't fought alone. This time, he had something worth protecting, something worth building. The skills that had made him legendary hadn't faded. They had found a new purpose. Autumn painted the Arizona hills in gold and crimson as Mike stood before the newly completed Paradise Valley Training Center. What had started as a simple community defense project had grown into something larger, a facility for training both law enforcement and military personnel in advanced tactical operations. Carlos moved through the morning drill with 4 new sniper teams, his experience setting the standard. The cartel's attack had exposed a need for specialized training in rural defense, and Paradise Valley had risen to meet that challenge. "Looking sharp," Jack said, approaching with coffee. "Got 3 more applications this morning, word spreading." Lucy's diner's grand reopening was scheduled for sunset, the new building standing prouder than before. Its Veterans Wall already, famous in law enforcement circles, displaying photos and medals alongside stories of service. Federal Task Force finished their final report, Carlos continued. Traced the corruption through 6 states. The Paradise Valley incident broke open. Something bigger than anyone expected. Mike watched as Carlos led a young marksman through a complex shooting drill. The shooter was from the Phoenix Police Department, one of many law enforcement officers seeking advanced training after word of the cartel takedown spread. Cooper made a deal, Jack added. Full cooperation for reduced sentence. He's been naming names all week. The morning sun caught the new sign at the training center's gate. Strength through vigilance. It had been Lucy's idea, like many of the changes that had transformed their town. Paradise Valley's former sheriff's replacement, Sarah Martinez, had proven to be exactly what the town needed. Her focus on community-based policing and advanced training had helped rebuild trust. Mike's phone buzzed. Another message from the Pentagon. More commendations, more requests for program expansion. They'd even suggested establishing similar centers nationwide. Town council meeting tonight, Carlos reminded him. They want to discuss making Paradise Valley a regional law enforcement hub. The idea would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, but things had changed. The cartel's attempt to corrupt their town had instead revealed its strength, transforming it into a symbol of resistance and renewal. Sarah Martinez approached, her bearing reflecting her Marine Corps background. "Sir, ready for the advanced course whenever you are." Mike nodded, noting how her confidence had grown since arriving. Like many of their trainees, she'd found more than just tactical instruction here. She'd found purpose. Lucy's truck pulled up, bringing lunch for the training team. She'd made it her mission to feed anyone training at the center, claiming sharp. Shooters needed proper fuel to maintain accuracy. "Got the final permits," she announced, adding a second floor to the diner, going to make it a proper gathering place for law enforcement and military personnel. The afternoon brought more visitors. Reporters working on follow-up stories, police chiefs interested in the program, even a few senators trying to rebuild their law enforcement credentials in the wake of the corruption scandal. But Mike's focus remained on the training field, where Sarah Martinez had just completed her first perfect qualification run. The pride in her eyes reflected something he remembered feeling long ago in the mountains of Afghanistan. "You ever miss it?" Carlos asked quietly. "The old life?" Mike watched as Sarah's team successfully completed another drill. "Miss what?" "The missions, the operations, who we were." Through his scope, Mike observed the heights where new sniper teams were learning their craft. "Sometimes, but this is better." Evening approached, painting the mountains in familiar purple and gold. The town had healed, but it had also grown stronger. What the cartel had intended as a base for corruption had become something else entirely, a center of excellence for those who protected others. Lucy called everyone in for dinner, the diner's new kitchen already famous among law enforcement. Drainers. The veterans' wall had expanded, now including photos from their own graduates alongside historical heroes. Federal Oversight Committee wants a full briefing, Jack mentioned between bites. They're trying to understand how one small town became a model for rural law enforcement training. "Let them study," Mike replied. The real lessons weren't in reports or briefings. They were in the spirit of a community that had refused to bow to evil. Sarah Martinez led the evening debrief, her confidence now matching her skill. She'd been their first success story. Now, she was their head instructor for law enforcement integration. 3 more departments requesting training slots, Carlos reported. Words getting around about our qualification standards. The sun set behind the training center as they finished. Dinner, stars emerging in the desert sky. Paradise Valley had found its new purpose, not just as a community that had resisted corruption, but as a place where others could learn to do the same. "You know they're still telling stories about the Ghost Canyon incident," Carlos said with a grin. "The cartel uses it as a warning now. Don't underestimate quiet towns or old warriors." Mike allowed himself a small smile. Let them tell their stories. The real victory wasn't in the battle itself, but in what they'd built from it, a place where the skills of war could serve the cause of peace. The training center would continue to grow, drawing those who sought to protect their own communities. The cartel had thought they found an easy target. Instead, they had catalyzed something far more powerful, a movement of trained professionals dedicated to defending quiet places. Sarah Martinez's voice carried from the range where she worked with the evening class. She had found her calling here, turning combat experience into teaching wisdom. Like many of their graduates, she represented the best outcome of their program. Skilled protectors who understood both the technical and human aspects of their profession. Got the latest statistics, Jack mentioned. Communities with our graduates show significant drops in organized crime activity. The cartels are learning to avoid them. Mike nodded, watching the night qualification course begin. Under the desert, stars, shooters learned more than just marksmanship. They learned patience, discipline, the quiet confidence that came from true skill. "You've built something special here," Lucy said, bringing fresh coffee to the observation post. "Something that matters." The war had found Mike Harrison again, but this time it had led to creation rather than destruction. The skills that had made him legendary hadn't faded. They had found a new purpose, teaching a new generation to protect what mattered. Paradise Valley had become more than just a town that had resisted evil. It had become a beacon, a place where quiet professionals learned to be more effective guardians of their communities. The cartel's attack had failed, but it had sparked something they never intended, a renaissance of skilled, ethical law enforcement. As the evening training continued under the stars, Mike watched the next generation of protectors honing their craft. The peace he'd sought hadn't been found in quiet retirement, but in passing on what he knew, in helping others become more effective guardians of their own communities. The war had come home, but its echo had built something beautiful, something that would outlast them all. In the quiet of a desert evening, surrounded by those learning to protect and serve, Mike Harrison had found his true legacy. Winter came early to Paradise Valley that year, a rare snowfall blanketing the training center in pristine white. Mike stood at the observation post, watching the sunrise paint the valley gold through his scope. Sarah Martinez's team was running cold weather drills, their movements precise despite the challenging conditions. Latest intel just came in. Carlos approached, frost crunching under his boots. "Remember those cartel files we recovered? They went deeper than anyone thought." Mike lowered his rifle, noting how naturally Sarah had adapted his teaching methods for her own students. "How deep?" "International connections. The Paradise Valley incident exposed links to weapons trafficking through 6 countries. Federal task force wants your input on the larger operation." The morning sun caught the new additions to the training center, specialized ranges designed for extreme distance shooting, urban combat simulators, and advanced tactical driving courses. What had started as a response to local threats had evolved into something far more comprehensive. "Got 4 new teams arriving next week," Jack added, joining them with steaming coffee. 2 federal, 1 military, 1 international. Your reputations. Spreading, old man. Lucy's truck wound up the access road, bringing breakfast for the morning class. The smell of her famous huevos rancheros had become legendary among trainees. She'd expanded her operation, now running both the diner in town and a full-service cafeteria at the training center. "Special delivery," she called out, pulling up. "And some interesting news from town. Those investors are back, but different ones this time, more professional." Mike studied her expression. "Cartel? Worse, maybe. Private military contractors. They're asking questions about the training center, trying to sound casual." Sarah approached, snow melting on her tactical gear. "Sir, we've got unusual movement on the perimeter sensors. Pattern doesn't match local wildlife." Through his scope, Mike scanned the ridgeline. Fresh tracks in the snow, professional work, carefully placed to avoid standard detection methods. Someone was probing their defenses, testing their security. Multiple contact points, Carlos confirmed, checking his tablet. They're mapping our blind spots, or trying to. Jack was already on his phone. I'll alert the federal task force. If these PMCs are who we think they are, they're connected to that weapons trafficking network. Let them come, Mike said quietly, watching another team of shadows move through. The snow. The last group that underestimated us learned an expensive lesson. Sarah's team had already shifted to enhanced security protocols, their training seamlessly transitioning to real-world operations. This was why Mike insisted on practical scenarios. The line between training and reality could blur instantly. Picking up encrypted communications, Carlos reported. Military grade, but not US patterns. Definitely professional operators. Lucy's expression hardened. They're not just watching the center. My suppliers reported similar surveillance in town. They're mapping everything. Good. Mike allowed himself a small, cold smile. Let them think they're being clever. Sarah, implement Protocol 7. Sarah nodded, immediately understanding. Protocol 7 was one of Mike's special additions to their security framework. A way of making their defenses appear weaker than they were, inviting overconfidence. Running facial recognition on our visitors, Jack said, studying his phone. Getting matches to known PMC operators. These guys have history. Iraq, Afghanistan, South America, high-end mercenaries. The morning sun climbed higher as Mike watched their observers through his scope. They were good, he had to admit. Professional movements, careful positioning, proper use of terrain. But they were still making a fundamental mistake, assuming they were dealing with a simple training facility. 4 more vehicles spotted on the access roads, Carlos reported. Taking up observation positions. They're establishing a full surveillance. Net. Perfect. Mike turned to Sarah. Time to give them a show. Run the winter warfare exercise, but add the special modifications we discussed. Sarah's smile matched his own. She understood. They would give their observers exactly what they expected to see. Carefully crafted scenes of routine training that concealed their true capabilities. Lucy spread the word in town, Mike continued. Normal operations. Business. As usual. Let our visitors think they're gathering valuable intelligence. The day progressed, each hour bringing reports of more surveillance. The PMCs were thorough, professional, methodical. They were building a complete picture of Paradise Valley's operations, or so they thought. They're focusing on the obvious, Carlos noted, watching through thermal imaging. Missing all the real security measures. That's the idea. Mike checked his Beret, the cold weather modifications ensuring reliable operation in the winter conditions. Let them think they've found our weaknesses. Sarah's team continued their exercises, each movement carefully calculated to support the deception. To untrained eyes, they appeared to be conducting standard drills. To professional observers, they appeared to be revealing operational patterns and vulnerabilities. Federal task force is standing by, Jack reported. They want to move on these guys now. Not yet. Mike watched another team of observers rotate positions. Let them commit fully. We need to identify everyone involved. Lucy returned from town with lunch and more intelligence. The PMCs had established themselves in multiple locations, setting up what they thought were covert observation posts. They were building detailed files on the training center's operations, personnel, and capabilities. They think they're being subtle, she said, serving hot coffee to the observation team. Even tried to recruit one of my waitresses for information gathering. And, Mike raised an eyebrow, she fed them exactly what we prepared. They think they're running a sophisticated intelligence operation. Actually, they're seeing exactly what we want them to see. The afternoon brought snow flurries, reducing visibility. The PMC teams adjusted their positions, demonstrating their professional training. They were good at their job, which made the deception all the more effective. Intercepted more communications, Carlos reported. They're preparing detailed analysis of our operations, identifying what they think are exploitable weaknesses. Excellent. Mike watched through his scope as another observation team rotated positions. They're following the exact pattern we predicted. Professional arrogance makes them predictable. Sarah's team had shifted to night operation drills, their movements visible to the observers, but concealing their true capabilities. Each exercise was carefully designed to support the false narrative they were creating. Federal Task Force is getting anxious, Jack warned. They're worried we're giving these guys too much intelligence. They don't understand. Mike checked. The weather forecast. More snow coming, perfect for what he had planned. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to let them think they're winning. The PMCs had spent a week building their intelligence picture, each day adding to their confidence. They thought they were mapping a sophisticated but ultimately vulnerable training facility. They had no idea they were actually participating in an elaborate counterintelligence operation. All teams report ready, Sarah announced as darkness fell. Observation posts identified and marked. Good. Mike shouldered his rifle, checking the night vision settings. Time to show our visitors the difference between watching and understanding. The snow began falling harder as Paradise Valley's true security teams moved into position. The PMCs were about to learn the same lesson as the Cartel. Sometimes the deadliest predators were the ones you never saw coming. Through the swirling snow, Mike watched their observers continue their work, unaware that they were now the ones being hunted. The winter storm would provide perfect cover for what was coming. Professional arrogance had led them into a carefully prepared trap, just like their predecessors. Paradise Valley had evolved beyond a simple training facility. It had become a sophisticated operation capable of turning enemy intelligence gathering against itself. The PMCs thought they were preparing for a takeover. Instead, they were walking into a lesson they would never forget. The storm intensified as Mike gave the signal to begin. In the darkness, Sarah's teams moved like ghosts through the snow, their true capabilities finally revealed. The observers were about to discover the difference between seeing and understanding, between watching and knowing. The winter storm raged on as Mike Harrison led his team through the swirling snow, their movements precise and purposeful. The private military contractors who had come to Paradise Valley seeking to exploit its secrets were about to learn a harsh lesson in the art of warfare. Through his night vision scope, Mike watched as the PMC observers continued their surveillance, unaware that they had fallen into a meticulously crafted trap. The training center's apparent vulnerabilities, carefully revealed over the past week, had been nothing more than bait, a lure to draw the mercenaries into overconfidence. Sarah Martinez, now Mike's most trusted lieutenant, moved her team into position. They had spent months training for this moment, honing their skills in the art of deception and counterintelligence. The PMCs, for all their professionalism, had underestimated the true capabilities of Paradise Valley's defenders. As the storm intensified, Mike gave the signal. In a flurry of coordinated movements, Sarah's team struck with precision and speed. The PMC observers, caught off guard by the sudden assault, found themselves outflanked and outnumbered. The battle was brief, but intense. The mercenaries, though highly trained, were no match for Mike's team and their intimate knowledge of the terrain. One by one, the observers were neutralized, their weapons confiscated, and their communications equipment seized. As the last of the PMCs surrendered, Mike surveyed the scene with a grim satisfaction. The trap had worked flawlessly, revealing the true extent of Paradise Valley's capabilities. But even as they celebrated their victory, Mike knew this was only the beginning. The intelligence gathered from the captured mercenaries confirmed their worst fears. The PMCs were indeed connected to the international weapons trafficking network that had been exposed in the wake of the cartel's defeat. But the scale of the operation was far larger than they had anticipated. "This goes beyond simple arms dealing," Jack said, poring over the seized documents. "They're moving military-grade hardware through multiple countries, supplying conflicts around the world." Carlos nodded, his face grim. And Paradise Valley was just one piece of the puzzle. They wanted our training center as a way to legitimize their operations, to create a veneer of respectability. Mike studied the intelligence reports, his mind racing. The PMCs had been thorough in their surveillance, building a detailed picture of the town's defenses. But they had made one critical error. They had assumed that Paradise Valley was just another target to be exploited. They had no idea that the town's transformation into a center of training excellence had been part of a larger plan, a way to create a network of highly skilled defenders who could respond to threats like this on a moment's notice. "The federal task force needs to see this immediately," Mike said, gathering the documents. "This is bigger than anything we've dealt with before." As Jack made the call to his contacts in Washington, Mike turned to Sarah. "Get the team ready. We need to move fast if we're going to contain this." Sarah nodded, already issuing orders through her radio. The training center had been designed for exactly this kind of rapid response, with equipment and personnel ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Within hours, Paradise Valley was a hive of activity. Federal agents arrived to take custody of the captured PMCs, while Mike's team prepared for a larger operation. The intelligence they had gathered pointed to a network of arms caches and staging areas scattered across the southwest, each one a critical node in the trafficking pipeline. "We'll need to hit them all simultaneously," Mike said, studying the map. "Cut off their distribution network before they have a chance to react." It was a daunting task, but one that Paradise Valley's defenders were uniquely suited for. Over the past year, they had trained dozens of teams in advanced tactics and rapid deployment. Now those teams would be put to the test. As the sun rose over the desert, a convoy of vehicles left the training center, each one carrying a heavily armed strike team. Their destination, a remote airstrip in New Mexico, where the PMCs had established a major transshipment point for their illicit cargo. Mike rode in the lead vehicle, his mind focused on the task ahead. This was what he had been preparing for all these months. A chance to strike a decisive blow against the forces that threatened everything he held dear. As they raced across the desert, Mike's thoughts turned to his fallen comrades, the ones who had given their lives in the service of a higher cause. Their sacrifices had led him to this moment, to a place where he could make a real difference in the world. The airstrip appeared on the horizon, a small cluster of buildings and hangars shimmering in the heat. Mike's team took up positions, ready to strike at his command. But as they prepared to move in, a sudden explosion ripped through the compound. The PMCs, it seemed, had been expecting an attack. Gunfire erupted from the buildings as the mercenaries poured out to meet the assault. Mike's team responded with disciplined fire, their training taking over as they advanced on the enemy positions. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with bullets flying in all directions. But Mike's team had the advantage of surprise and superior tactics. They moved with fluid precision, flanking the enemy positions and cutting off their escape routes. As the fighting intensified, Mike caught sight of a familiar face among the mercenaries, a man he had once served with in Afghanistan, now fighting on the wrong side of the law. The betrayal stung, but Mike pushed the feeling aside. There would be time for recriminations later. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun, with the last of the PMCs surrendering in the face of overwhelming force. As Mike's team secured the airstrip, they began the task of cataloging the contents of the warehouses. What they found was staggering. Crates of weapons, ammunition, and explosives, enough to supply a small army. But even more disturbing were the documents they uncovered: shipping manifests, bank records, and encrypted communications that hinted at the true scope of the operation. This was no simple arms smuggling ring, Mike realized. This was a global enterprise with tentacles reaching into the highest levels of government and industry. The implications were staggering. As the sun set over the desert, Mike sat in the command center, poring over the intelligence reports. The picture that emerged was one of a shadow war being fought on a scale he had never imagined. But even as the enormity of the challenge dawned on him, Mike felt a sense of purpose that he had not known in years. This was what he had been training for all his life. A chance to make a real difference in the world, to strike a blow against the forces of chaos and destruction. He thought of his team, of Sarah and Jack and Carlos and all the others who had stood by his side through thick and thin. They were more than just soldiers. They were a family, bound together by a shared commitment to something greater than themselves. And Paradise Valley was more than just a town. It was a symbol, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed to be teetering on the brink of darkness. It was a place where people could come to learn, to grow, to become something more than they had ever dreamed possible. As Mike looked out over the desert, he knew that the road ahead would be long and hard. There would be setbacks and challenges, moments of doubt and despair, but he also knew that he would not be facing those challenges alone. He had his team, his family, and a growing network of allies and supporters who shared his vision of a world where the forces of good could triumph over the forces of evil. And so, as the night deepened and the stars emerged over the desert sky, Mike Harrison sat in the command center, planning his next move. There was still much work to be done, still many battles to be fought. But for now, he could take a moment to savor the sweet taste of victory, to revel in the knowledge that he and his team had struck a blow for justice and righteousness. And as he looked out over the vast expanse of the desert, Mike knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be guided on the front lines of a war that would determine the fate of the world itself. The road ahead would be hard, but it was a road he was ready to travel. For Mike Harrison, there was no other choice. This was his destiny, his calling, and he would see it through to the end, no matter what the cost. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mike stood up and stretched, ready to face another day in the fight against the darkness. There was work to be done, and he was ready to do it. With a final glance at the intelligence reports scattered across the table, Mike headed out into the cool morning air, ready to lead his team into battle once more. The war was far from over, but with each victory, they were one step closer to a world where peace and justice could reign supreme. And for Mike Harrison, that was a world worth fighting for, no matter how long it took or how hard the road might be. He had found his purpose, his reason for being, and he would not rest until that purpose was fulfilled. As he climbed into the lead vehicle and gave the signal to move out, Mike felt a sense of clarity and purpose that he had never known before. This was his moment, his chance to make a difference in the world, and he would not let that chance slip away. With a final nod to his team, Mike Harrison set out into the desert, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The road would be long and the battles hard-fought, but he knew that in the end, the forces of good would prevail, and that was a future worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The sun hung low over the horizon as Mike Harrison and his team returned to Paradise Valley, the dust of the New Mexico desert still clinging to their vehicles. The successful raid on the PMC airstrip had dealt a significant blow to the weapons trafficking operation, but Mike knew it was only the beginning of a much larger fight. As they pulled into the training center, Sarah Martinez was waiting for them, a grim expression on her face. "We've got a situation," she said, holding up a tablet. "The feds intercepted a communication between the PMCs and their backers. They're planning to retaliate." Mike frowned, taking the tablet and scanning the decrypted message. The PMCs, it seemed, were not content to lick their wounds and retreat. Instead, they were preparing to launch a full-scale assault on Paradise Valley itself. "They want to make an example of us," Jack said, peering over Mike's shoulder. "Show the world what happens to those who stand in their way." Carlos nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "They'll come in hard and fast, try to overwhelm our defenses before we have a chance to react." Mike handed the tablet back to Sarah, his mind already racing. "Then we'll have to be ready for them. We've got the home field advantage, and we've been preparing for this moment for months." He turned to his team, his eyes blazing with determination. "This is what we've been training for. Paradise Valley is our home, and we'll defend it with everything we've got." Over the next few hours, the training center became a hive of activity. Weapons were checked and rechecked, ammunition stockpiled, and defensive positions fortified. Mike worked closely with Sarah and Jack to devise a battle plan, one that would use the town's unique terrain and layout to their advantage. As night fell, the residents of Paradise Valley gathered in the community center, their faces etched with worry and fear. Mike stood before them, his voice steady and assured. "I know you're all afraid," he said, looking out over the sea of faces, "but I want you to know that we will not let any harm come to this town or its people. Paradise Valley is more than just a place. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we stand together." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The men who are coming here tonight think they can take that away from us. They think they can break our spirit and crush our resolve. But they're wrong." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Mike felt a surge of pride. These were not just his neighbors and friends, they were his family, bound together by a shared love for their community and a fierce determination to protect it. "So I ask you now to stand with us," Mike continued, his voice rising with emotion. "Stand with us as we defend our home, our way of life, and everything we hold dear. Together, we will show the world that Paradise Valley is more than just a town. It's a beacon of hope in a world that often seems consumed by darkness. As the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, Mike felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had faced many challenges in his life, but none quite like this. The stakes had never been higher, the enemy never more formidable. But as he looked out over the faces of his team and the residents of Paradise Valley, Mike knew that he was not alone. They would face this threat together, united in their resolve to protect the place they called home. As the night wore on, the town settled into an eerie quiet. The streets were deserted, the windows shuttered and barred. But beneath the surface, Paradise Valley was alive with activity. In the training center, Mike and his team made their final preparations. Weapons were loaded, communication lines tested, and contingency plans reviewed. Sarah and Jack took up positions on the rooftops, their sniper rifles at the ready. Carlos and his team set up a perimeter around the town, laying traps and obstacles to slow the PMC's advance. They had spent months studying the terrain, identifying choke points and ambush sites that would give them the advantage in a fight. As the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky, Mike received word from the federal task force. The PMCs were on the move, a convoy of heavily armed vehicles speeding towards Paradise Valley. "This is it," Mike said, his voice calm and steady over the radio. "Remember your training, trust your instincts, and look out for each other. We'll get through this together." The first shots rang out just as the sun crested the horizon, a barrage of gunfire and explosions that shattered the morning calm. The PMCs had launched their assault, attempting to punch through the town's defenses with sheer force and firepower. But Mike and his team were ready for them. From their elevated positions, Sarah and Jack rained down sniper fire on the attackers, picking off key targets with ruthless efficiency. Carlos and his team emerged from their concealed positions, launching a series of devastating ambushes that left the PMCs reeling. In the streets of Paradise Valley, the residents took up arms to defend their homes. They fought with a fierce determination, using every weapon at their disposal to repel the invaders. Mike moved among them, rallying their spirits and directing their efforts. As the battle raged on, the PMCs began to falter. They had underestimated the resolve of Paradise Valley's defenders, and their initial assault had failed to break through the town's defenses. But they were not ready to give up yet. With a roar of engines, a second wave of vehicles burst through the perimeter, disgorging heavily armed mercenaries into the streets. They moved with deadly precision, seeking to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers and firepower. But Mike and his team met them head-on, engaging in a fierce close quarters battle that left the streets littered with bodies and debris. Sarah and Jack abandoned their sniper positions, joining the fray with their assault rifles blazing. As the fighting reached a fever pitch, Mike caught sight of a familiar figure among the PMCs. The same man he had seen at the airstrip, the one who had once served by his side in Afghanistan. The betrayal still stung, but Mike pushed the feeling aside. There would be time for reckoning later. With a final, desperate push, the PMCs made a bid to break through to the town center, seeking to capture the community's leaders and break their resolve. But Mike and his team were there to meet them, fighting with a savage determination that left the mercenaries reeling. In the end, it was Carlos who struck the decisive blow. With a daring flanking maneuver, he led his team behind the PMC's lines, attacking them from the rear and cutting off their escape route. Caught between two fronts, the mercenaries soon surrendered. their will to fight finally broken. As the dust settled over Paradise Valley, Mike surveyed the aftermath of the battle. The town had taken heavy damage, with buildings reduced to rubble and streets choked with debris, but the community had held strong, their spirit unbroken in the face of overwhelming odds. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion as she surveyed the scene. "We held the line." Mike nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of further threats. "We did more than that," he said, his voice heavy with pride. "We showed the world what happens when you mess with Paradise Valley." In the days that followed, the town began the long process of rebuilding. Federal agents poured in to secure the area, arresting the surviving PMCs and seizing their weapons and equipment. The scale of the trafficking operation they had uncovered was staggering, with links to conflicts and criminal organizations around the world. But for Mike and his team, the focus remained on Paradise Valley. They had defended their home, their way of life, and the bonds of community that held them together. And in doing so, they had become more than just a team of skilled warriors. They had become a symbol of hope and resilience in a world that often seemed consumed by darkness. As the weeks turned into months, Paradise Valley began to thrive once more. The training center expanded, drawing in new recruits from across the country who sought to learn from Mike and his team. The community center became a hub of activity, hosting events and gatherings that brought the town closer together than ever before. And through it all, Mike remained a constant presence, a guiding light for those who looked to him for leadership and inspiration. He knew that the fight against the forces of darkness was far from over, that there would always be those who sought to prey on the weak and vulnerable. But he also knew that he would not be facing those challenges alone. He had his team, his family, and a community that had proven its strength and resilience in the face of unimaginable odds. As he looked out over the town he had fought so hard to protect, Mike felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was his home, his purpose, and his reason for being, and he would continue to fight for it no matter what the future might bring. For in the end, that was what it meant to be a warrior, to stand tall in the face of darkness, to protect those who could not protect themselves, and to never give up, no matter how long the odds or how fierce the opposition. And in Paradise Valley, that warrior spirit burned brighter than ever before, a beacon of hope and light in a world that all too often seemed consumed by shadows. The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as Mike Harrison stood on the porch of his farmhouse, looking out over the fields that stretched before him. In the distance he could see the lights of Paradise Valley twinkling to life, a reminder of the community he had fought so hard to protect. It had been 6 months since the PMC attack, and life in the town had slowly begun to return to normal. The scars of battle still lingered, in the bullet holes that pockmarked the walls of the community center, in the empty seats at the diner where fallen friends once sat. But the people of Paradise Valley had proven their resilience, their determination to rebuild and move forward. For Mike, the last few months had been a time of reflection and planning. The threat posed by the weapons trafficking operation had been neutralized, but he knew that it was only a matter of time before new challenges emerged. The world was a dangerous place, and there would always be those who sought to exploit the weak and vulnerable for their own gain. That was why he had thrown himself into his work at the training center, pouring his energy and expertise into preparing the next generation of warriors to face the battles to come. He had always known that his own time on the front lines was limited, that there would come a day when he would have to pass the torch to others. But as he looked out over the peaceful fields and the thriving town beyond, Mike knew that his work was far from finished. There were still threats to be confronted, still dangers lurking in the shadows, and he would not rest until he had done everything in his power to ensure that Paradise Valley and all the communities like it were safe from harm. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Jack, his old friend and comrade in arms, who had been working tirelessly to track down the remaining threads of the weapons trafficking operation. "We've got a lead," Jack's message read. "A big one. Meet me at the diner in an hour." Mike felt a familiar surge of adrenaline course through his veins as he read the words. He had known that this moment would come, that the fight was far from over. But he also knew that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. With a final glance at the setting sun, Mike turned and headed inside to gear up. There was work to be done. An hour later, Mike walked through the doors of Lucy's diner, the bell above, the entrance jingling cheerfully as he entered. The place was bustling with activity, as always, locals chatting over coffee and pie, tourists snapping photos of the famous Veterans Wall. But Mike's focus was on the back booth, where Jack and Sarah were waiting for him, their faces grim with purpose. He slid into the seat beside them, nodding in greeting as Lucy appeared with a fresh pot of coffee. "You're going to want to hear this," Jack said, sliding a file folder across the table. "We've been tracking a series of suspicious shipments coming out of Eastern Europe. Military-grade weapons and equipment, all of it destined for the States." Mike flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the documents within. Shipping manifests, bank records, encrypted communications, all of it pointing to a shadowy network of arms dealers and war profiteers. "We think it's connected to the PMCs," Sarah chimed in, her voice low and urgent. "The same ones who attacked Paradise Valley. They've been using their contacts in the underworld to build up a new arsenal, preparing for something big." Mike felt a chill run down his spine as he absorbed the information. He had always known that the PMCs were just the tip of the iceberg, that there were deeper, darker forces at work behind the scenes. But the scale of what Jack and Sarah were suggesting was staggering. "We need to move fast," Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. "If these weapons make it onto American soil, there's no telling what kind of damage they could do." Mike nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We'll need to assemble a team," he said, his voice calm and measured. "The best of the best, people we can trust." Sarah and Jack exchanged a glance, a flicker of understanding passing between them. They had been through this before, the gathering of the old guard, the rallying of the troops. It was a dance they knew well. "I'll make some calls," Jack said, rising from the booth. "See who's available. We'll need people with expertise in weapons, infiltration, and close-quarters combat. I'll handle logistics," Sarah added, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Transportation, equipment, supplies. We'll need to move fast and quiet." Mike nodded, his own mind already whirring with plans and contingencies. "I'll take point on intelligence," he said, tapping the file folder. "We need to know everything there is to know about this operation, who's involved, where the shipments are coming from, and where they're headed." As the three of them set to work, Mike felt a sense of purpose settle over him, a clarity of focus. that he had not felt in months. This was what he was meant to do, he realized. Not just to train others, but to lead them into battle himself. For the next several days, the training center hummed with activity as Mike and his team prepared for the mission ahead. They pored over intelligence reports and satellite imagery, mapping out the network of arms dealers and their supply chains. They drilled in close-quarters combat and rapid infiltration, honing their skills to a razor's edge. And through it all, Mike felt a sense of pride and purpose that he had not known in years. This was his calling, he realized, not just to defend his own community, but to take the fight to the enemy, wherever they might be. As the day of the mission approached, Mike found himself spending more and more time at the training center, going over every detail of the plan with his team. They would be inserting into Eastern Europe under cover of darkness, targeting a series of key warehouses and transit points where the weapons were being staged for shipment. It would be a dangerous mission, Mike knew, one that would require all of their skills and training. But he also knew that they were ready for whatever lay ahead. On the eve of the operation, Mike found himself alone in the armory, checking and double-checking his equipment. The familiar weight of his rifle in his hands, the tightness of his body armor against his chest, it all felt right, like a piece of himself that he had been missing for too long. As he sat there, surrounded by the tools of his trade, Mike's mind drifted back to the battles he had fought and the comrades he had lost along the way. He thought of his old team, of the sacrifices they had made in the name of a higher calling, and he thought of Paradise Valley, of the community that had taken him in and given him a new sense of purpose. He knew that he would do whatever it took to keep them safe, to ensure that they could thrive in a world that often seemed consumed by darkness. With a final check of his gear, Mike rose to his feet and headed for the door. There was work to be done, and he would not rest until it was finished. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Mike felt a sense of calm settle over him, a clarity of purpose that he had not known in years. This was his mission, his calling, and he would see it through to the end, no matter what the cost. For in the end, that was what it meant to be a warrior, to stand tall in the face of darkness, to fight for those who could not fight for themselves, and to never give up, no matter how long the odds or how fierce the opposition. And as he looked up at the stars glittering overhead, Mike knew that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. He had his team, his training, and a cause worth fighting for, and that was all he needed to face the battles to come. With a final nod to the night sky, Mike turned and headed towards the waiting transport, his heart full of purpose and his mind focused on the mission ahead. The road would be long and the fight would be hard, but he knew that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. For in Paradise Valley, the warrior spirit burned brighter than ever before, a beacon of hope and light in a world that all too often seemed consumed by shadow. And as long as there were people like Mike Harrison and his team to stand against the darkness, that light would never be extinguished. The engines roared to life as the transport lifted off, carrying Mike and his team towards their destiny. And as the lights of Paradise Valley faded into the distance behind them, Mike felt a sense of calm settle over him, a knowledge that no matter what the future might bring, he would always have a place to call home and a cause worth fighting for.